She sat in the quiet hum of privilege, a phantom in seat 12 amperes. Her head was bowed, a posture of deference or exhaustion, making her almost invisible to those who mattered. The man across the aisle, encased in a tailored suit, let his gaze slide over her and then away, his expression tightening with a faint, sour distaste. A flight attendant, his smile a perfect, polished veneer, saw her and his internal calculus shifted. She was not a guest to be pampered, but a problem to be managed. She didn't belong here, in this hushed sanctuary of calfskin leather and complimentary champagne, and every person who noticed her felt it like a discordant note in a flawless symphony. The cabin of Flight 767 was a world meticulously crafted to insulate its inhabitants from the coarseness of reality. The air itself seemed filtered, carrying the subtle scents of expensive perfume and freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of the classes behind the curtain. The lighting was a soft, warm gold, designed to flatter and soothe, reflecting gently off the polished wood grain accents and the silver rims of champagne flutes. The ambient noise was a low, peaceful drone, the distant roar of the engines transformed into a lullaby, punctuated only by the soft clink of ice in a glass or the rustle of a newspaper. This was a space built for men like Mr. Sterling. Arthur Sterling, seated comfortably in 12B, considered the cabin his natural habitat. His suit was a sharp, dark, navy Italian wool that probably cost more than the woman's entire wardrobe for the last decade. His cufflinks were solid gold, monogrammed, and they caught the overhead light with a discreet, wealthy glint each time he moved his hand. His watch, a Patek Philippe, was a marvel of engineering that sat on his wrist, not as a time-telling device, but as a declaration of his station in life. He had not clawed his way to the top of the corporate ladder, battling in boardrooms and closing multi-million-dollar deals, to share his rarefied air with that. His eyes, cold and analytical, flicked back to the woman in 12 amperes, Alara Vance. He hadn't bothered to learn her name, but he had already written her entire life story in his head. The hoodie, a faded, shapeless gray garment, the color of a dreary winter sky, was worn thin at the cuffs and bore a faint, unidentifiable stain near the collar. Her cargo pants were a mess of wrinkles, their pockets bulging slightly as if stuffed with trivial, forgotten things. And her boots, they were the worst offense. They were heavy, practical things, scuffed at the toes and caked with the faint memory of dried mud in the seams of the soles. They were boots made for walking on solid, unforgiving ground, not for resting on the plush carpeting of a first-class cabin. Security is getting lax, Sterling thought, his lips pressing into a thin line of disapproval. He prided himself on his ability to assess people in an instant, a skill honed by years of negotiations. He saw weakness, a lack of discipline, a life lived without ambition. People who presented themselves that way were liabilities. They were unpredictable. They didn't respect the established order of things. Her presence felt like a tear in the very fabric of his meticulously ordered world. He made a mental note to write a strongly worded email to the airline. Standards, after all, were everything. Across the aisle, in 11C, Clarissa Davenport shared his sentiment, though her judgment was rooted less in order and more in aesthetics. She viewed the world through the large, dark lenses of her Gucci sunglasses, which she kept on despite the cabin's dim lighting. They were part of her armor, just like the Hermes scarf draped artfully around her neck and the perfectly manicured crimson nails that were currently tapping an impatient rhythm on her phone screen. She leaned toward her husband, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that was intentionally loud enough to carry. "Darling, look," she murmured, gesturing with a subtle tilt of her head. "Honestly, how did that get through? It completely lowers the tone of the entire cabin. You'd think for what we pay, they could at least enforce a dress code." Her husband grunted in agreement, not looking up from his Financial Times. Clarissa sighed, the sound a delicate expression of profound suffering. She saw Alara not as a person, but as an affront to her senses. The woman's very existence was a piece of grit in the oyster of her luxurious travel experience. She felt a second-hand embarrassment, as if the woman's shabby appearance might somehow be contagious, a blight upon them all. She took a surreptitious photo with her phone, already composing a witty, scathing caption for her private social media group. Number travel nightmare, number first class fail. Ilara felt the weight of their stares. She had felt it from the moment she stepped onto the plane. It was a familiar pressure, a cloak of assumptions she had learned to wear like a second skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn canvas of the laptop bag at her feet. Its zipper was broken, the teeth mismatched and snagged on the fabric, a detail Mr. Sterling had noted with an internal sneer. To him, it was a sign of carelessness. To Ilara, it was a reminder of a hasty exit from a hotel in Brussels, a necessary casualty in a mission that had succeeded by the narrowest of margins. She remained perfectly still, her breathing even and slow. Her shoulders were hunched, not in shame, but in a deliberate effort to make herself smaller, to occupy less space, to fade into the background. It was a conscious act of disappearing, a skill she had honed over years of living in the shadows. She had learned that people's contempt was a powerful form of camouflage. When they dismissed you, they stopped seeing you. And when they stopped seeing you, you were free to see everything. She saw the subtle tension in Mr. Sterling's jaw, the way he held his shoulders with a rigid entitlement. She saw the flicker of insecurity behind Clarissa's haughty expression, the desperate need for validation in her every gesture. She saw the flight attendant, Kyle, as he moved through the cabin, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Kyle approached their row, his movements smooth and practiced. He was young, ambitious, and he knew that the key to promotion in his line of work was keeping the high-value passengers happy. He'd already clocked Mr. Sterling as a platinum member and recognized Clarissa from a society magazine. The woman in 12 amperes, however, was an anomaly. Her ticket was valid, paid for by a corporate entity he didn't recognize, but she didn't fit. She was a disruption. He could feel the irritation radiating from Sterling and Davenport, and he knew he had to do something. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" he asked, his voice a warm, professional purr. He addressed Mr. Sterling first, then Clarissa's husband. When he turned to Ilara, his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. His tone shifted, becoming slightly more perfunctory, less welcoming. "Ma'am, something for you? Water, perhaps?" The implication was clear. Champagne would be wasted on her. Ilara lifted her head for the first time, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes met his. Her eyes were a deep, dark gray, the color of a storm-tossed sea. They were startlingly clear and held a depth that seemed entirely at odds with her drab appearance. There was no anger in them, no shame, no defiance. There was only a calm, unnerving stillness, an unnerving perception that made Kyle feel, for a split second, like he was the one being analyzed. "No, thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, low, and steady. It held no tremor, no hint of apology. The brief eye contact was enough to throw him off his rhythm. He quickly recovered, giving a curt nod and moving on. But the image of her eyes lingered. There was a story there, he realized, but it was one written in a language he couldn't comprehend. He shook the feeling off. She was a problem, and he would deal with her. For the next 20 minutes, Ilara endured the silent assault. A man walking down the aisle bumped his briefcase against her shoulder without apology, instead shooting her a glare, as if her very presence had inconvenienced him. When Clarissa needed to get up, she said, "Excuse me," with a tone that suggested Ilara was a piece of furniture she was forced to navigate around. Through it all, Ilara's face remained a mask of calm neutrality, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. It wasn't anger. Anger was a luxury, an indulgence she couldn't afford. It was a cold, sharp-edged weariness. She was tired of the masks, tired of the charade. She remembered a time, long ago, when she could walk into a room and be seen for who she was. She remembered the warmth of her mother's smile, the pride in her eyes. Her mother, who had also understood the art of being underestimated, but who had never let the world's judgment dim her own light. A dull ache throbbed in Ilara's chest, a familiar ghost of grief. Her hand, resting on her lap, tightened into a fist for a single, controlled moment before relaxing again. Her thumb brushed over a small, almost invisible tear in the fabric of her hoodie, a nervous habit she could never quite break. This judgment, this dismissal, it was part of the price. The anonymity was her shield, but sometimes it felt like a cage. She was a ghost, a whisper, a non-entity. That was her strength. That was her curse. Mr. Sterling watched her, his irritation growing with every passing minute of her silent, obstinate presence. It was the stillness that bothered him most. He had expected her to look uncomfortable, ashamed, out of place. He wanted her to fidget, to shrink under his glare. But she did none of those things. She simply sat, existing, breathing his air, and her calm defiance was more infuriating than any outburst could have been. It was an unspoken challenge to his authority, to the natural order he believed in. He caught Kyle's eye as the flight attendant passed by again. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just raised a single, questioning eyebrow and gave a subtle nod in Alara's direction. The message was unmistakable. Do something about this. Kyle understood perfectly. His professional smile clicked back into place, but this time it was tinged with the grim determination of a man on a mission. The comfort and satisfaction of his premier passengers were paramount. If that meant displacing one insignificant passenger to appease the others, it was a small and necessary price to pay. The aircraft was still boarding the last of its passengers. There would be an empty middle seat in the back, squeezed between a snoring man and a fussy infant, he was sure. It was a fitting place for someone like her. He straightened his tie, took a deep, fortifying breath, and began to walk towards seat 12 amperes. The low hum of the cabin seemed to recede. For the handful of passengers who were paying attention, the world narrowed to this small, impending confrontation. Clarissa lowered her sunglasses slightly, a glint of cruel anticipation in her eyes. Mr. Sterling leaned back, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He was about to witness the restoration of order. He was about to watch the anomaly be corrected. The cabin lights flickered once, a momentary, almost imperceptible dip in power that no one, save one person, registered as anything more than a minor electrical quirk. Alara's head tilted, just a fraction of an inch. Her gaze, which had been fixed on her bag, lifted slightly, becoming distant, unfocused. She wasn't looking at the approaching flight attendant. She was listening to the faint, almost subaudible whine in the aircraft's electronics, to a ghost in the machine that no one else could hear. Kyle stopped beside her seat, casting a long shadow over her. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, expectant quiet. "Ma'am," he began, his voice dripping with practiced, condescending politeness. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to move." Kyle's voice, a smooth instrument of corporate policy, sliced through the hushed air. "Ma'am," he began, the single word laden with a patronizing finality. "For the comfort of our other first-class passengers, I'm afraid we've had to reassign your seat. We have a spot for you in the main cabin." He didn't present it as a request. It was a verdict. His smile remained fixed, a placid mask that didn't betray the small, satisfying thrill of exercising his authority. He expected a protest, a flash of anger, perhaps even tears of humiliation. Such a reaction would validate his decision, proving she lacked the composure and decorum required for this exclusive space. Mr. Sterling leaned back, the faint smirk on his lips widening ever so slightly. He crossed his arms, a king observing the quiet expulsion of a peasant from his court. Across the aisle, Clarissa watched with the rapt attention of someone enjoying a particularly satisfying scene in a reality television show. This was justice, in its own small, luxurious way. Alara Vance did none of the things they expected. She looked up at Kyle, her dark gray eyes holding his for a long, unblinking moment. There was no defiance in her gaze, but there was also no submission. There was only a profound, unsettling stillness, as if she were looking straight through his crisp uniform and practiced smile to the nervous, ambitious young man beneath. Then, she gave a single, slow nod. "Of course," she said. Her voice, still quiet and steady, held no trace of emotion. It was the simple, toneless acceptance of a fact. Without another word, she reached down and took hold of her worn laptop bag. Her movements were fluid and economical, devoid of any hurry or shame. She stood up, her frame surprisingly lithe beneath the bulky hoodie, and stepped into the aisle. The silence she left in her wake was more unnerving to Kyle than any argument could have been. He felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling of having fundamentally misjudged a situation, though he couldn't articulate why. He pushed the feeling down, chalking it up to the woman's oddness. As Alara began her walk down the length of the plane, a palpable sense of relief and superiority rippled through the first-class cabin. It was a collective exhalation of breath they didn't know they'd been holding. She was the disruption, and now she was being removed. Order was restored. Her boots made a faint, rhythmic squeak on the plush carpet, the only sound accompanying the low drone of the engines. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back ramrod straight. She was aware of the whispers that followed her, the subtle shift of bodies as people turned to watch her pass. She felt the invisible pinpricks of dozens of eyes on her back. "Can you believe the nerve?" a woman whispered, her voice sharp with indignation, acting like she belonged here. Two young men, their hair artfully messy, and their clothes bearing the logos of expensive, obscure brands, snickered. One of them held up his phone, angling it for a discreet video. Going back to where she came from, he muttered to his friend, who laughed. Mr. Sterling watched her go until she passed through the curtain separating the classes, a physical and symbolic barrier. He turned to the man seated next to him, a fellow executive he'd recognized from a conference in Dubai. "That's more like it," Sterling said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble, restoring a bit of balance. The world behind the curtain was different. The lighting was harsher, the seats narrower, the air thick with the scent of cheap air freshener and crowded humanity. The peaceful drone of the engines was now a loud, insistent hum that vibrated through the floor. Kyle had not bothered to escort her. A different flight attendant, a harried-looking woman with tired eyes, pointed her toward a vacant middle seat in the last row, wedged directly beside the lavatories. Ilara settled into the cramped space. Her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. The air smelled faintly of chemical disinfectant. To her right, a large man was already asleep, his head lolling back, a soft snore escaping his lips. To her left, a young mother tried desperately to soothe a fussy toddler. The child looked at Alara with wide, curious eyes. Alara met the child's gaze and offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, a fleeting crack in her stoic facade. The mother, noticing the exchange, gave her a brief, weary smile of solidarity. It was the first shred of human kindness Alara had been shown on the entire flight. For a while, she simply sat, her hands resting on the laptop bag in her lap. The plane finished boarding, the doors were sealed, and the aircraft began its slow taxi toward the runway. Most people would have felt the sting of humiliation, the burning shame of being so publicly cast out. Alara felt something else, a quiet sense of liberation. Here, in the anonymous chaos of economy class, she was truly invisible. No one expected anything of her. She was free to work. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, she unzipped her bag and carefully lifted out her laptop. It was an old, ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook, its magnesium alloy case covered in a latticework of scratches and a significant dent on one corner, as if it had been dropped from a great height, which it had been, twice. She opened the lid. The screen flickered to life, its colors slightly washed out, its resolution, a relic of a bygone technological era. Her fingers, however, were anything but slow. They moved over the keyboard with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing, typing strings of commands into a stark black terminal window. She wasn't browsing the internet or checking emails. She was listening. Her action, however, did not go unnoticed. The man in the seat in front of her, a stocky individual in a tight-fitting polo shirt, turned around, his face a mask of suspicion. "What's she doing with that piece of junk?" he said to his wife, his voice loud enough to carry over the engine noise. His wife, a woman with sharply drawn eyebrows and a nervous disposition, leaned over to get a better look. The screen full of cryptic, scrolling text looked menacing to her. "My God, George, is she trying to hack the plane or something?" The word hack shot through the nearby rows like an electric current. Heads turned. Phones were discreetly raised again. The two young men from first class, who had come back to use the lavatory, spotted her and began filming openly now, their faces alight with a kind of cruel glee. "Caught her," one of them whispered into his phone's camera. "Weird lady is definitely up to something." The whispers grew into a low, anxious murmur. The tired-eyed flight attendant, her name tag reading Sandra, noticed the commotion and strode down the aisle, her expression grim. She was a veteran of the skies, a woman who operated strictly by the book and had no time for nonsense. She saw Alara, the strange laptop, and the nervous passengers, and she made a swift, decisive judgment. She stopped next to Alara's seat, her presence casting a new shadow. "Ma'am," she said, and her voice was nothing like Kyle's. It was sharp, hard, and devoid of any pretense of politeness. "You need to shut that down. Now." Alara's fingers paused their dance over the keys. She looked up at Sandra, her gray eyes calm and analytical. "I'm not connected to the plane's network," she stated quietly. It was the truth. She was running a passive diagnostic, merely sweeping the ambient radio frequencies within the cabin. But Sandra was not in a mood for technicalities. She saw a non-compliant passenger and a potential security threat. "I don't care what you're doing," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Airline regulations are clear. Unapproved electronic devices of that nature are prohibited. Shut it down, or I will confiscate it." For a moment, a flicker of something hard and dangerous passed through Alara's eyes. A part of her, the part that had survived ambushes in dusty alleys and outsmarted intelligence agencies, wanted to challenge this woman, to explain the critical importance of what she was doing, but she suppressed it. A public confrontation would only make things worse. It would draw the wrong kind of attention and alert the very entity she was trying to track. Silently, she complied. She executed a final command, saving the initial scan data, and then shut the laptop down. She closed the lid with a soft click and slid it back into her bag, placing it under the seat in front of her. The passengers who had been watching let out another collective sigh, this one of nervous relief. The threat, in their minds, had been neutralized. "Unbelievable, George," the man in the polo shirt muttered, shaking his head. "People like her shouldn't be allowed to fly." The young influencer, emboldened, posted his video online. The caption read, "Crazy hacker lady on my flight tries to take us all down. Flight attendants save the day. Number hero, number flight 767. Within minutes, it began to rack up likes and comments. Alara knew none of this. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. She appeared to be resting, another weary traveler on a long journey. But behind her closed eyelids, her mind was racing. The scan had been brief, but it had been enough. It wasn't just a glitch she had detected earlier. It was a signal, a tiny, encrypted data packet, cloaked and repeating on a secure satellite frequency reserved for the aircraft's primary navigation system. It was a digital parasite, burrowing its way into the plane's central nervous system. The signal was faint, sophisticated, and bore the unmistakable digital signature of a ghost she had been hunting for years. It was the calling card of a cyber-terrorist group known only as Oblivion. They weren't supposed to be active. They had been dismantled, their leaders captured or killed, or so the official reports claimed. But she knew better. She had known they would resurface. And now, their signature was pinging inside the very plane she was on. They weren't just hacking the plane. They were preparing to seize control of it. By forcing her to shut down her laptop, the flight attendant and the paranoid passengers had done Oblivion's work for them. They had blinded her, cutting her off from the one tool she had to fight back. She sat perfectly still, a lone, isolated figure in the back of the plane, carrying a secret that could mean the life or death of everyone on board. The injustice of her situation was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was dwarfed by the icy grip of a far greater fear. The lights of the cabin flickered again, longer this time, and the plane gave a sudden, sickening lurch. The real trouble was just beginning. The second lurch was not like the first. The first had been a sickening drop, a momentary hiccup in the laws of physics. This was a violent, bone-jarring slam, as if the aircraft had been struck by a giant, invisible hand. A collective scream ripped through the cabin, a sound of pure, primal terror that drowned out the groaning shriek of stressed metal. The overhead bins rattled violently, and a few sprang open, spilling their contents into the aisle. The lights didn't just flicker this time, they died completely. For 3 terrifying seconds, the cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint, eerie glow of the emergency exit signs. Panic, raw and untethered, erupted. In the first-class cabin, Mr. Sterling's carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. He gripped his armrests, his knuckles white, his face a pasty shade of gray. All his wealth, all his influence, meant nothing at 35,000 feet. He was just another man falling out of the sky. Clarissa was screaming, a high, thin sound of utter hysteria. Her designer sunglasses knocked askew on her face. The young men who had been filming were now cowering in their seats, their phones forgotten on the floor. Their arrogance had been replaced by the wide-eyed terror of children lost in the dark. When the emergency lights flickered on, casting the cabin in a ghastly, dim orange glow, it did little to quell the chaos. The plane began to buck and sway, not with the rhythmic tremble of turbulence, but with the erratic, unpredictable movements of a system in its death throes. Up in the cockpit, the scene was one of controlled, desperate chaos. A synthesized voice, calm and terrifyingly persistent, repeated from the speakers. "Stall! Stall! Pull up! Stall!" Red lights flashed across the control panel like a swarm of angry fireflies. "I've lost the primary controls," the co-pilot shouted, his voice cracking. He was young, barely 30, and sweat was pouring down his face, stinging his eyes. He wrestled with his yoke, but it felt dead in his hands, unresponsive. "The hydraulics are gone. Autopilot is disengaged, but I have no manual response." The captain, a veteran with 20 years of flight time and nerves forged in thunderstorms over the Atlantic, was fighting his own battle. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, flicking switches, trying to reboot systems, but nothing was working. Every command he entered was met with a cascade of error messages. The navigation screens were a mess of scrambled code, the plane's location a blinking, uncertain question mark. This wasn't a mechanical failure. He knew it in his gut. A storm you could fly around. An engine failure you could compensate for. This was different. This felt like a poison, spreading through the aircraft's digital veins. It felt deliberate. His eyes darted to the printed passenger manifest he'd reviewed before takeoff. One name had stuck out, flagged with a security tag he'd never seen before. Vance, Elara, classified, do not record. On a desperate hunch, a protocol drilled into him in a top-secret briefing years ago for a scenario he never believed he'd encounter. He grabbed the secure satellite phone. His fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled for a moment before he punched in the number for the emergency command center at Langley. The voice on the other end was clipped and professional. "Flight 767, go ahead. This is Captain Avians," he said, his voice strained but steady over the wail of the alarms. "I have a passenger, Elara Vance. I need confirmation on a Protocol 7. There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the crackle of static and the pounding of the captain's own heart. Then the voice came back, laced with disbelief. "Captain, repeat that name." "Vance. Elara Vance." The silence was even longer this time. Finally, the voice returned, low and heavy. "Sir, that's impossible. According to this file, Elara Vance was declared Kia 5 years ago during an operation in the Black Sea. That file is sealed at the highest level. She's a ghost." The captain's blood ran cold. A ghost. If she was dead, then who was on his plane? But if she was alive, and Oblivion was active, then this flight was not a random target. He swallowed hard. It was a long shot, a prayer in the dark, but it was the only one he had left. He set the phone down and flicked on the cabin-wide intercom. His voice cut through the terrified screams, a sudden, authoritative presence in the chaos. He didn't offer false reassurances. He issued a command. "Nix 11, if you hear me, request confirmation, status alert 7. The cabin fell into a stunned, confused silence. The message was bizarre, nonsensical. Who was Nix 11? What did status alert 7 mean? It was a string of words from a spy movie, utterly out of place amidst their real-life terror. Then, from the cramped confines of the last row, a figure stood up. The transformation was absolute. The slumped, defeated posture was gone. Elara Vance now stood tall, her shoulders squared, her body language radiating an aura of lethal competence. The dull, vacant look in her eyes had been replaced by a gaze as sharp and focused as a laser sight, sweeping across the cabin, assessing, prioritizing. The shapeless gray hoodie no longer looked like the garment of a vagrant. It now looked like a uniform, a deliberate choice for blending in. Every eye was drawn to her. A new kind of silence fell over the passengers, the silence of profound, mind-altering shock. She took a single, purposeful step into the aisle, and an air marshal, a broad-shouldered man in a nondescript blazer who had been trying to calm passengers, moved instantly to intercept her. He was big, professional, and his hand was already resting on the concealed firearm at his hip. "Ma'am, sit down, now," he ordered, his voice low and firm. In a crisis, a non-compliant passenger was a threat, regardless of who they were. Alara didn't stop. She didn't even look at him as a threat. She looked at him as an obstacle to be managed. "I need to get to the cockpit," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with chilling authority. "That's not going to happen." "Sit down, or I'll make you," he warned, stepping directly into her path. She finally met his eyes, and the calm intensity in her gaze made the trained lawman hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Check the protocol for a status alert 7, she said coolly. "Then check the branded microdermal implant behind my left ear." The marshal froze. Status alert 7. It was a code he'd learned in a briefing room, deep underground, a theoretical protocol for a worst-case scenario involving an active asset from a unit that officially didn't exist. He'd never imagined he would hear it used. His professional skepticism battled with the sudden, jarring recognition of the code. "Let me see," he demanded. Alara turned her head slightly, pulling back her messy hair and tilting her head down. There, just behind her earlobe, nestled against the pale skin of her neck, was a faint, silvery mark. It wasn't a tattoo or a scar from an injury. It was a perfect, tiny delta symbol, with 2 intersecting lines through the center, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence under the dim emergency lights. It was the unmistakable insignia of a ghost unit known in the deepest circles of intelligence only as Nyx. The air marshal's face went white. All the color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. His training, his instincts, his entire understanding of the chain of command reconfigured itself in an instant. His hand dropped from his weapon as if it had been burned. The threat wasn't the woman in front of him. The threat was what she was here to fight. He took a half step back, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. "My God," he breathed. The cabin remained in a state of suspended animation. "Mr." Sterling stared, his mouth agape, the gears in his pragmatic, business-oriented mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Clarissa had stopped screaming, her hand covering her mouth as a new, more profound horror dawned on her, the horror of her own monumental ignorance. The young men with the phones looked as if they had just seen a ghost, which, in a way, they had. Alara didn't wait for a formal invitation. The marshal's silent acquiescence was all the permission she needed. She pushed past him and began to walk toward the front of the plane, her heavy boots now making a determined, rhythmic sound on the floor. She was a woman on a mission, a specter made solid, walking out of the shadows and into the heart of the storm. The path to the cockpit cleared before her as if by magic, passengers shrinking back into their seats, their faces a gallery of disbelief. The woman they had ridiculed, the outcast they had banished, was now their only hope. Of course, here is the final chapter, bringing the story to its conclusion and delivering the central moral lesson. Alara reached the cockpit door. It was locked, a final barrier between her and the crisis. She didn't knock. She raised her fist and pounded on the reinforced metal 3 times. A sharp, authoritative rhythm, thump, 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 a prearranged signal for a dire emergency. A moment later, the electronic lock clicked open. She pushed the door inward and stepped into the flashing red chaos of the cockpit. The wail of the stall alarm was deafening. The co-pilot was still fighting the controls, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that was giving way to despair. Captain Evians looked up as she entered, and in his eyes, she saw not just fear, but a flicker of desperate, impossible hope. "Nyx 11?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Affirmative," Alara said, her voice cutting cleanly through the alarms. She wasted no time on pleasantries or explanations. She pointed to the co-pilot. "Get him out of the seat." The co-pilot looked at the captain, bewildered, but Evans gave a sharp nod. "Do it!" Scrambling, The young man unbuckled himself and moved into the small space behind the seats. Ilara slid into his place, her movements practiced and sure. She ignored the dead controls. They were irrelevant now, mere puppets for the digital master pulling their strings. From her bag, she produced the old Panasonic Toughbook. With a single, fluid motion, she flipped it open and retrieved a coiled cable from her pocket, a custom-built interface with a shielded data port on one end. She located a small, unassuming panel below the main console, marked Auxiliary Systems Maintenance. It was a port no pilot was ever meant to use in flight. She pried the cover off with her fingernails and jacked the cable in. "What are you doing?" the captain asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Performing a digital exorcism," she replied without looking up. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. The battered laptop, which had been an object of scorn just minutes before, was now the most important piece of technology on the plane. Green lines of code scrolled down the screen, a language only she could understand. Oblivion's signature is all over the primary flight control system. They've locked you out. They're forcing the plane into an aerodynamic stall. Back in the cabin, the passengers were on a razor's edge between hope and utter despair. They watched the closed cockpit door as if it were the gate to their salvation or their tomb. The plane was still shuddering, still losing altitude, but the presence of the mysterious woman had introduced a new, incomprehensible variable into their fate. Mr. Sterling sat rigid in his seat, his mind replaying every moment of his interaction with Ilara. The condescending glare, the dismissive wave of his hand, the satisfaction he'd felt seeing her walk away. Each memory was now a hot coal of shame in his gut. He had judged the book by its cover, and the cover had been a masterpiece of deception, hiding a text of which he could not even begin to comprehend the first word. Clarissa had removed her sunglasses, her face streaked with tears and mascara. The armor was gone. She felt naked, exposed, not just by the fear of death, but by the sudden, glaring light of her own superficiality. The woman she had dismissed as trash was, at this very moment, the only thing standing between her and oblivion. The young influencer who had posted the video was fumbling with his phone, his hands shaking too badly to operate the screen. He had to delete it. He had to erase the evidence of his cruel, smug stupidity. The video wasn't a funny clip anymore. It was a monument to his own ignorance, broadcast for the world to see. The only person who seemed to find a strange sense of calm was the young mother in the back. She held her toddler close, stroking his hair, and watched the cockpit door with an unwavering faith. She had seen something in Ilara's eyes earlier, not weakness, but a quiet, powerful resilience. She hadn't known what it was, but she had recognized it as strength. And now, she clung to that memory. In the cockpit, Ilara's face was illuminated by the glow of her screen. "They've created a ghost loop in the navigation software, feeding you false altitude and airspeed data," she explained, her voice a low, focused monotone. "The alarms are part of the attack, designed to induce panic and force pilot error. We're going to ignore them." With a final string of commands, she hit enter. CMD, override, execute, Nix 11. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The alarms continued to blare. Then, one by one, the red warning lights on the main console began to blink out. The synthesized voice crying, "Stall," fell silent. A new set of data flickered onto the captain's screen, the true data. "My God," Evians breathed. "We're in a controlled dive, not a stall." "They were steering you into the ocean, making it look like pilot error," Ilara said. "I've severed their connection and firewalled the flight controls. You have the plane back, Captain." Evan's hands closed over the yoke. It responded. It was sluggish, heavy, but it was his. With a grunt of exertion, he pulled back, fighting the momentum of the dive. The groan of the engines changed pitch as he slowly, painstakingly began to level the aircraft out. The violent shuddering subsided, replaced by the familiar, steady hum of controlled flight. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. This time, it was laced with an exhaustion so profound it was almost palpable, but beneath it was a bedrock of relief. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We have resolved the technical issue. We are stable and have resumed our course. We will be landing safely." A wave of sound washed through the cabin, sobs of relief, ragged cheers, applause. They had been pulled back from the brink. They were alive. When the chaos subsided, a new, heavy silence fell. Every passenger was acutely aware of who they had to thank. The cockpit door opened, and Alara Vance stepped out. She looked exactly the same, the faded hoodie, the wrinkled pants, the worn-out boots. But now, no one saw a vagrant. They saw a savior. She walked back down the aisle, her face as impassive as ever. The whispers that followed her this time were not of scorn, but of awe. As she passed first class, Mr. Sterling struggled to his feet. He was a man accustomed to being in charge, to speaking his mind. But now, he found he had no words. I'm sorry, he stammered, the apology feeling pathetically inadequate. I was wrong. Elara paused and looked at him. Her gray eyes held no anger, no triumph, only a deep, weary wisdom. The world is full of people who do what's needed, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of 100 battles. They don't always wear a suit. She didn't wait for a response. She continued down the aisle and settled back into her cramped middle seat in the last row, as if nothing had happened. She put her laptop away, leaned her head back, and closed her eyes. The plane landed without incident. As the passengers filed out into the bright, solid reality of the terminal, they moved with a strange, new solemnity. They had survived a plane crash that never happened, and they had been saved by the person they had collectively deemed worthless. At the gate, a man in a dark, nondescript suit was waiting. He approached Alara as she disembarked, speaking in a low voice meant only for her. Miss Vance, a remarkable piece of work. Your status can be reinstated. Full honors, full identity. Alara looked at him, then glanced back at the stream of passengers, at Mr. Sterling avoiding her gaze, at Clarissa hurrying past with her head down, at the young influencer staring at his shoes. No, she said softly, they don't need a name to remember the lesson. She slung her laptop bag over her shoulder, a ghost once more. She turned and walked away, not toward the waiting black car the agent had prepared, but toward the main concourse, her heavy boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She disappeared into the anonymous river of travelers, her job done, leaving behind a plane full of people who would forever carry the weight of her quiet, powerful truth, that a person's worth is not measured by the seat they occupy, but by the courage they hold within. And sometimes, the greatest strength is found in the places you least expect it, hidden behind a cover you were too quick to judge.